Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. This is episode 137, which is part 2, the conclusion, of my interview with Leslie McFadden. This is a powerful episode full of Leslie's passion to not only tell her rape story, but also to have a persuasive impact on the way law enforcement investigates sexual assault and rape and how victims and survivors are treated. This isn't a call out of just the New York Police Department, but to law enforcement everywhere to become trauma-informed, sensitive, and empathic to victims and survivors, and thorough victim-centered investigators. In addition, this is a call to action for everyone listening. We'll pick up right where we left off from last week's episode. Here's Leslie.
It just didn't go well for the most part. Whenever they would go interview someone, he wouldn't really tell me exactly what they said, but he would kind of give me little pieces here and there. But I would be able to tell by the tone of his voice whether or not it was good or not. The only interview that was really helpful, aside from the one they did with Brian, my husband, was when they went to go talk to Melanie, and she's a nurse. She had thought, based on my symptoms and the fact that I woke up very suddenly without a feeling of being drugged, in her opinion, she thought it was GHB. That really resonated with Santos because he thought it was GHB too. That goes out of your system really quickly, but based on the symptoms, that's what he thought it was. Like, he really liked that interview. While they were in Florida, they went to interview my mom, and they interviewed her for hours at the schools. It was her last day before she retired. She spoke to them for hours about how she saw me after the assault, how disappointed she was with the first detective and how he didn't do his job and all of that. So they did that for hours. And then one day, Santos said, "Can you come by the station?" And I thought, oh, something happened. So I was excited, but also nervous because this is not typical. He had me come by the station. We go upstairs, and he's got a different guy there now that I hadn't met before. They wanted to talk to me about their interview with Melanie, my friend. Then they tell me that what she remembered from her conversation with me is that at one point I told the perpetrator no and to get off me. And they wanted to know if I remembered saying that. And there was this moment where I thought, all I have to do is say, yes, that's what I remember. And who would know? Who would know what was in my brain at the time? The problem was, I didn't remember saying that. I don't know why she said that. I did not remember saying that at all. And I wrestle with it because I thought I could just say yes. I could just say, that's what I remember. And then she's corroborating me, and then we have something. But I just couldn't do it because that's not what I remembered. So I said, I really wish I could say, yes, I remembered that, but I don't remember saying that. And he just looked at me, and he just looked sad because I think he really wanted me to say that I remembered. I just didn't. And I couldn't figure out why she remembered me saying that. I later spoke to her about it, and she swears that I said that to her. For the life of me, no idea why she remembered it that way. And there's part of me that wonders if I did tell her that and just wiped that slice of trauma out of my brain forever. I don't know. I will never have an answer for that.
Very possible. Absolutely. There is a real possibility that you said that and that it is gone.
I do think in retrospect that I did say that to her, but in that moment, I just couldn't agree. I couldn't remember it, and I couldn't agree.
It may never, ever, ever come back as a clear memory. Sometimes those things do, and you go, something, I don't like the word triggers, but something activates that memory.
Yes.
And a whole bunch of other stuff comes back. It goes back to what we were saying earlier. In a properly conducted trauma-informed interview, the questions are designed to help you remember more, because there's something called explicit memories are memories you know you have. Implicit memories are memories that are in your brain, but nothing has activated them yet. Explicit memory can activate implicit memory. I teach this all the time. If you're asking the right questions in the right ways, it will result in a never-ending conversation of refreshed memories, of activated memories.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how powerful explicit memory can be to activate implicit memory. Yeah. And I know this has happened to you. All you have to do is think back to certain occasions where you're recalling memories to somebody, and as you're talking about a memory, you go all of a sudden, oh, and there's something else I remember. Now that I've said this, oh, let me tell you this. This also just popped into my mind.
Yes.
What that means is that what you just said activated an implicit memory. And it can be an implicit memory that you've never told anybody before. It can be an implicit memory that you have never had before. It didn't have to be an explicit memory that you forgot about.
Right.
It can be an implicit memory that never, ever exposed itself before. And you can go, oh, I've never thought about this before until just now. What you said or what I said makes me remember this, and this also happened. Yeah. And those memories can be decades old.
Yeah.
So the fact that you actually said something and then forgot it, it may never come back to your explicit memory experience that you ever told anybody that you had told him no.
Yeah.
Don't feel weird. It's the way the human memory works.
So Santos just looked sad, and I ended up leaving the precinct. I was so disappointed leaving that I totally forgot that at the start of that conversation, he had told me that the chief was in the office, Chief Osgood, and that he wanted to meet me. But I was so upset when I left, I completely forgot about that. That was the man who reopened my case. So I didn't get to meet him. And I didn't think of that until I had gone all the way home. I missed that opportunity. Around that time, partner Nella Gomez, she came to my house. They wanted to test the dress. So the dress that I had spilled wine all over, they thought maybe that wine had been tainted with whatever he had drugged me with. So they wanted to test that. And as it turns out, the state lab couldn't do that test, which was very surprising because if you think about Law and Order SVU, like they can test anything, but in real life, they couldn't do it. They ended up having to work with NMS Labs, the same lab that I used to do that test. They had never done it before, but they figured out how to do it. And so she came to the house and I showed her approximately where I thought it would have spilled just based on the way I had been sitting that night. So I had this renewed hope, like, okay, maybe this is it. They test the dress, they'll find something there. They also were going to do yet another test with somehow there was still enough urine sample, they could do another test. And so I have this hope, okay, this is it. We're finally going to figure this out. But no, they didn't come back with anything. It was just another dead end. Santos also, they chased a lot of dead ends. They went to the state where the perp lived. They went to his town. They even went so far as to, I don't know how they figured this out, but they found a bar that he frequents. And apparently there had been a lot of GHB cases in that area. And they spoke with a sergeant who was there. And he had a case that was similar to mine. While they were out there, they were supposed to talk to this particular victim. I don't know if they did, because I had never heard the end of that. But they chased a lot of dead ends that just didn't go anywhere. But they tried their hardest to chase down every bit of evidence. They also tried to get the surveillance tapes from the hotel, but because the original detective never got them, they were gone. Like those tapes were long gone. They also tried getting receipts from the bar, but those were long gone. There was no corroborating evidence of how many drinks I had or what my condition was like at the hotel. But they did get witness statements from the people who worked there. And there was an incident report that talked about how I was acting. They did have that. So he's telling me all this and that it wasn't great. And a lot of the statements from my colleagues certainly didn't help because I never spoke with anybody. And so the only person they talked to was the perp. Their statements didn't help. One day I was walking home and I get a call from Santos. His voice was shaking, which was very unusual. And he told me that the chief was gone. So the chief that I reopened my case, he was gone. He left the NYPD. They removed him as the head of SVD and he retired shortly after that. The NYPD had shut down Santos's unit. And then Santos told me that he was retiring as a result. It was like blow after blow after blow. I said, what about Nella, his partner? He said something very cryptic. He said, don't ask them about that. They won't like that. And it just gave me chills. I don't even remember the last thing I said to him. It was a very short conversation. I just remember his voice was shaking and you could tell that this was hard for him. And after we hung up, I just stood there on the sidewalk. All of a sudden, just there was no hope. Everything was done, over. So I had gone home and I talked to Jane Manning and told her everything that happened. The next day, I went with her to police headquarters and we were going to talk to the chief of detectives and the new head of the Special Victims Division. And she was bringing along another survivor. I didn't know, but I met that day. And we were going to tell them our stories and the ways that our cases had been mishandled by the start, explain our cases had been reopened, but now with Chief Osgood gone and the detectives gone, there was still work to be done to resolve our cases. I go to this meeting, and this was really the first time that I had, at least to my knowledge, interacted with a survivor. I've since found out a lot of people I know are survivors, but at the time, this was the first time that I had met another survivor. She was so nervous. I remember her saying to me, what if I start crying in front of them? She was really worried about crying in front of them. And for some reason, that just made me mad that she was worried about them. And I said, if you cry, you cry. Like, they will just have to take it. So we go to this meeting. I'm sitting across from the chief of detectives, from the new head of the SVD, and then there was a third person there whose name I immediately forgot, but we're sitting there. The other survivor goes first, and she told her story, and it was heartbreaking. I definitely disassociated while she was talking. It was so hard to hear. It was too much. And instead, I focused on their faces while she was talking. And I was really proud of her, even though I just met her, but I was really proud of her for doing so well. And I could just see they were uncomfortable. They were shifting around in their seats, looking down. She was making them twitch. And then it was my turn. And I was very determined that I was not going to do that. I was going to make it really clear how I was wronged and explain all the things that went wrong in my case. And I was kind of going to bring them back. I felt like it was a really good meeting. I felt like they heard us. They took us seriously, got a firm handshake from the chief of detectives, and it felt like a great meeting. 6 days later, I'm sitting in the office with Jane talking to an assistant district attorney. One of the things that I had remembered the perp saying on the controlled call was that when he was trying to explain why he hadn't called me, once he found out I was in the hospital, he said, I didn't know what the protocol was. I didn't know if there was a drug test or a police report. When I was talking to the assistant district attorney, she kind of made a face when I was explaining that. And she said, I don't remember him saying that. I said, no, he said it. I remember that clearly. He said it. And she said, well, I have the call right here. And she held up this CD, and which was kind of startling because I hadn't heard that call since I was in that call myself. And so she asked if she could play it. I didn't really feel like there was another choice, so I said yes. And she played it. And the moment where I thought that he would say that line, it came and went. It wasn't how I remembered him saying it. The part about he didn't know what the protocol was, it wasn't all in the same sentence. And he didn't mention a drug test, but he did ask about a police report. But it was not connected the way I remembered it. And he didn't mention a drug test. And I was just so upset that I remembered this wrong and was shocked. I actually know better. I studied psychology in college, and one of my professors did this experiment one day where she had someone who actually worked in the lab with this person, and she got a phone call in the middle of class, like noisily answered her phone. The professor got really upset, said like, excuse me, you need to hang up or leave. And this person stayed on the phone, and she walked out of the class super noisily, and everybody was murmuring and shocked. And it turned out that it was an experiment. The professor wanted to see what we had noticed about this woman. And so we were supposed to write down our answers about what we remembered. I actually knew this person, so I was closer to the reality. But descriptions of what her hair was like, what she was wearing, were all over the place. I knew better that even though you think you're going to remember everything and you're so sure of yourself, you can be wrong, even about the things that you're sure about. But in that moment, I just wanted to be out of that room. I was so horrified that I had remembered this sentence wrong, and that the thing that I had put down in my notes and was so sure about was just dead wrong. He never mentioned a drug test. He did ask if I had gotten my stomach pumped, which was something, but he didn't ask about a drug test. And so that was really hard for me to hear that. Jane pushed for her to talk to a toxicologist about the fact that I had pinpoint pupils and I was exhibiting very erratic symptoms hours after I had stopped drinking. And could she talk to a toxicologist to get their opinion on why that would be the case? And so she agreed to keep my case open longer while she talked to a toxicologist. It was like the dimmest of hopes at this point. I just wasn't clinging to very much. A few months go by. Jane had suggested that I give an interview with this news outlet, that the reporter had agreed to anonymize my name if I wanted to. It was very safe if I was comfortable doing this, but could I talk about my experience? And I wanted to help in any way that I could and talk about what the NYPD had done. I felt that was important. So I agreed to do the interview. It was my very first one, and I didn't want to use my real name. At that point, I was still scared and still working with the perpetrator at work. So I do this interview, and the woman was very kind. She was just asking me questions about what happened. At one point, she said, "Do you remember the name of the detective?" And I said, "Oh, I will never forget it." And I told her, and I just heard this audible gasp on the other side of the line. And I waited because I wasn't sure what had happened. And she said, "That was my detective." I felt like the floor had just shifted under me. I could not believe what I just heard. My whole body jerked when she said that. I was just really taken aback. We just instantly kind of dropped the pretense of doing the interview and we just started comparing notes. It turned out there was a lot of parallels to mine, and that he had told her that she was the most nervous person he had ever seen do this.
Oh, wow.
And it became kind of a funny moment because I said, well, he told me I was the second most nervous person he'd ever seen. So I didn't know he was talking about you. And we had a good laugh over that. It was just wild. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. The key did this to more than one person, and probably more than just the two of us. I was floored. So fast forward a few months, I am giving my second interview, and this time I'm going to use my real name. I go to the office, where this reporter is. She takes me on a little tour of the building. I'm getting really nervous. We sit down for the interview and we're going through it. And I'm just telling her, going back through the story. And then I got to the part where I explained how Osgood was removed and the unit was shut down and all of the stuff and how hard it was to hear that. And I told her about the meeting that we had the next day at headquarters. And she kind of cocked her head to the side and she said, "What if I told you that they have a new DFSA team and they put that detective on it and he's co-leading it?" And she also told me that they put that detective on the other survivor's case who came to headquarters with me. And I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I was so shocked. I don't even know what I said in response. It was, who knows? I said something like pretty whatever on the record, but then off the record, I was, what the fuck? I was floored. This was a turning point for me. This was when I was actually angry. I hadn't really been angry before, but then I got angry. I went home and I fired off an email to the commander of the SVD and was basically, "How dare you? How dare you do that?" I was beside myself with how angry I was. And then she said something very cryptic that she was going to have the detective call me. The detective. She didn't say who it was. And so I was really alarmed. I didn't know who was going to call me. I get this call. It's a block number. We know what that means. I just let it go to voicemail because I didn't know who was calling me. I didn't know if it was that detective. I don't want to talk to him. It turned out it was this other detective I'd never spoken to before. I ended up calling him back, but I was so angry. I will say he was very nice, but I said, "I am so sorry. I don't want to talk to you. because like you're obviously just being pawned off on me to get rid of me. I want to talk to your chief. I just was not having it. He said at one point my case was closed. I said, what do you mean it's not closed? It's not supposed to be closed. I couldn't believe what he was saying. I was furious. He ended up calling me later and leaving me a voicemail. And he said that he had talked to the assistant district attorney and he wanted to clarify that actually, no, it was still open. She was still doing some more steps. It's closed on the police side, but it can be reopened with a push of a button. I replayed back the voicemail and I listened to it a few times. And it dawned on me what he was saying, that it could be reopened with a push of a button. That just really struck me, just how easy it was to get a case reopened. And I thought, how many survivors know that it's so easy? That was really a turning point for me. I started giving more media interviews. I testified in front of the New York City Council. I was really angry that they not only messed up my case, which was pretty bad, but then they willfully put this same detective, instead of punishing him, they rewarded him and put him on this other survivor's case. You can't accidentally do that. It was very personal to me. I felt like they had gone out of their way to screw us over. I was so angry. So one day I had this idea that I was finally going to file a formal complaint against the original detective. I didn't really know how to do that. So I filed it with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. That was an organization that I knew about. So I filed it with them. Wasn't really sure what would happen, but I said what I said and sent it off. And then I get a call one day, block number. It's a sergeant. He's calling in regards to my complaint. And then he tells me he's that detective's sergeant. So, who better to investigate but his boss? On this particular call, he was not very nice. He was pretty abrasive. He said, well, he was just doing what you asked him to, that you wanted your case closed. That's what he said to me. And I lost it. I told him that is not at all what I wanted. I contacted him so many times. I emailed him. And he said, well, is this not your, like I could see it. He said, is this not your signature on this form? And I said, well, I can't see it, but I signed a form. He said it was going to put the case on hold pending further incriminating evidence. And he said, there is no case pending form. And I was stunned because then I realized for the first time, I don't know what the heck I signed. And I said, what did I sign? And he said, it's a case closure form. So he put a case closure form in front of me the same day that I reported the rape.
And lied about what it was. So, hey, Sergeant, Supervisor, could you add that to my complaint? Because he lied to me and I didn't know what I was saying. Wow.
And he proceeds to read the sentence to me. And he said, is this not your handwriting? I said, oh, I can't see it. But that doesn't sound like something I would write, like pending further incriminating evidence. That doesn't sound like something I would write. That sounds like something he would have written on the form to make me think that's what it was. At the end of the call, I said, I have emails that I sent to him. I can send those to you. And he didn't really ask me for them. And I said, don't you want them? And he said, why? What would that prove? And I said, well, it would show that I didn't want my case closed and I was trying to cooperate. And so he grudgingly said that I could send them over. So I did. And I ended up getting the call records from my dad because my dad had called a bunch of times. And being a lawyer, he kept a log. Every time he called, like what he was told, missed him, wasn't there, didn't call back, whatever. So he had a log. And so I sent that too. A month later, I get a call from him. This time it's very different, very nice to me. And he said, you're right. He said, I looked at the emails and I looked at the call notes that you sent, and you're right. You were trying to cooperate. And then he said something that shocked me. He said that this detective had been removed from the Special Victims Division, effective immediately. And I was so stunned because I was so ready for a fight, based on the last conversation. I was so ready for that. I was just so excited. I couldn't believe that I had actually managed to get rid of him literally 5 years later, but he was removed. A short time later, I started questioning it because I didn't have proof that this had happened. I had him telling me that it happened, but I didn't have proof. And I still didn't have a copy of the form I signed. So I emailed him and I asked him for both. They wouldn't give it to me. They wouldn't give me even a copy of the form I signed. So I got Jane involved and we went around and around with the new chief. They would not give it to us. Meanwhile, and this is like something straight out of a movie, Jane called me one day and she said, "You'll never guess what I found in my mailbox." Somebody had dropped off the form, folded up in her mailbox, the form that I had signed that day at the precinct. So the chief and this sergeant, they didn't know that we had it, but we actually had it. We just kept going with the argument, but we actually already had it. What's really sad about that form is there was not even an NYPD logo on it. It looks like I just typed it up myself. Like it's just like a fill in the blank kind of form. There's no logo on it. The detective's signature is not on it. It just looks like I'm talking to myself. Like it just said, "I, Leslie McFadden, want my case to be closed." The only thing that's in my handwriting is my signature down at the bottom and the fill in the blank for my name and the detective's name. That's it. That's the thing that kept me from justice. It's like the most pathetic looking piece of paper that you've seen. It's not even clear what the form is. Like it doesn't say case closure form. There's nothing super obvious.
There's no title to it.
There's no title.
No logo on it.
No logo on it.
NYPD nomenclature of any kind. It's like he had this form that he typed up himself, is what my imagination is leading me to, printed off several copies of that, and carries them around with him every time he goes on a sex assault investigation. Here, sign this. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
That is mind-boggling.
Yeah. And I couldn't believe this is what they didn't want to turn over. And they were also fighting me over the release of the record that showed that he had been removed from the SVD. And that really raised my suspicion because I thought, well, right. I cannot trust them. Like, what if they just said he was removed and he's still there? Like, I need to know. I need to see the documentation that he was removed. And they were fighting me tooth and nail. I went back and I was talking to the same reporter who had that detective. She's great. She's so smart. She went and requested a copy of that record. She ended up getting it to me. So I actually had a copy of it before they knew I had a copy of it. That record did show that he had been removed. That was definitely a victorious moment.
Yeah.
That it really happened. But I just could not believe the obstruction, that they just did not want to give me the records. I wanted to see the complete police file. I wanted to see all my records of what people said and what detective work had been done. So I FOIL requested the records from the DA's office and the NYPD. It was the most bureaucratic thing ever. I had to jump through so many hoops and I had to wait a really long time. By that point, I had moved to California, started a new job. I eventually left my job. COVID had started. That delayed things even further. That whole process took years, and all I ever got was redacted record. But it gets better. I poured over what they did send, and yes, heavily redacted. And I realized my interview with Santos and his partner wasn't there. What they had in place of my interview was the notes that I had voluntarily given. There's no record. Well, there's a record of the interview taking place, but what they put as the summary of that interview is my notes. There's no other report, which is wild. And then there were other things. I noticed that there was no report at all of my mom's interview. Nothing. I emailed the records officer and I said, I know this interview took place. My mom knows it took place. It was audio recorded. There is no record of that audio recording. It's gone. Conveniently, the 2 interviews that would contain complaints against the NYPD, myself and my mom's, gone. So there's no record of either one of us complaining about our original experience with the detective. They also tried to say that everything was redacted because everybody had requested anonymity. Even Melanie. I called their bluff. I said, give me a list of people that requested anonymity. Give me the names. Melanie wasn't on there, of course. And so I said, she's not on there. Give me her record. I did get her record. And it did have that part in there about what I had told her. But I was able to call their bluff, and there was it was a security officer that worked at the hotel, and he had not requested anonymity. So I ended up getting that record, and he remembered me acting very crazy in the lobby, flashing people, like jumping up on furniture, like crazy stuff. It was mind-blowing how I had to fight tooth and nail for every single record that I got. Like I said, it took a long time for me to even get what I got. This was in 2020. I had just nearly given up on everything, and I get a call. Jane had spoken with Chief Osgood. He had been cleaning out his garage, and he found some notes that he had taken about a case he'd been looking at that time and was considering to reopen. And he knew he couldn't take it back to the NYPD because they never knew about it in the first place. They would have just thrown it out. And so he called Jane and asked if she was in touch with me. So I eventually got to meet Osgood, finally. It was a very healing experience to meet with him after so many years. I'd always been like on the cusp of meeting him, but I never actually met him. He ends up telling me a story about what happened from his perspective. And he said that he had looked over the case when Jane first told him about it, and he was in complete agreement. My case had not been properly investigated. In fact, because I had been exhibiting such erratic symptoms hours after I had stopped drinking, that he felt like I was telling the truth, like I had been drugged with something, and he thought it was worthy of reopening. And so he's explaining all this to me. And he also said that because this detective, the original detective, would have had to have gone to his supervisor and tell him about the controlled call in order to figure out what to do, he would have been told to close the case because the phone call was like, quote unquote, neutral, meaning there's no probative evidence. So he would have been told to close the case. He also told me that over 90% of controlled calls are neutral. And I was so stunned by that. And I thought that is wild that anyone is doing controlled calls. If there's such a high rate of failure, why on earth are they being used so often? It just goes to show you how horribly wrong things can go when you're not doing these controlled calls or these pretextual calls properly, and the damage it can do, not just to the case, but to the victim. Like in my case, I just was so distraught during this call, but I stayed on it trying to get information and wound up, because of the flow of the conversation, apologizing to the perpetrator. And I'm trying to go along with this call, and I'm laughing along with him. And that's what I have to live with, that
It's
memory.
re-traumatizing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. It just added to your trauma, and trauma is cumulative. And what happens is it has long-term implications and impacts on your life. This should have never happened. And I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So he is kind of telling me the background information. He told me he picked Santos to work on my case because he didn't want to have another Brooklyn-based detective picking up the work that another Brooklyn-based detective had messed up. So he wanted a Manhattan-based detective with a lot of experience working this case. So he picked Santos, and they worked very closely together on my case. Osgood had him give him daily updates, so he was staying on top of this. So he was very familiar with my case. So a bit of context as far as why he was removed, and I'm sure he can give you more information than what I'm going to give you. There was a Department of Investigation, like a DOI investigation into SVD, and Osgood had given that agency all the information they asked for, memos. He gave them information. And so his point of view was this was retaliation for cooperating and giving them all this information instead of stonewalling. This was a punishment for giving that information. They were going to move him to head of patrol in Staten Island, which is it's a huge demotion. And so he ended up retiring shortly after that. That's a bit of context there. But before all that happened, the cases like mine, the other DFSA cases, and I think there were some others as well, not just the drug-related ones, that he was told to close them, to, as they put it, close all the bullshit cases. And he told me this, and my heart nearly stopped. Like, what? He said he was told to shit can them. And I said, hold on. They actually use this word, shit can? And he said, yeah, that's how they refer to shutting these cases down. And I thought I was going to have a meltdown that they would use such a derogatory word for the trauma that people are going through. These are real people, real cases. The heartlessness blew my mind. I was just about ready to explode. I mean, I appreciated that he told me everything and was honest, but I was just shocked, to say the least. What I didn't know at the time was he was the one that suggested to Jane and some other advocates that a letter should be sent to the Department of Justice to ask for an investigation into the Special Victims Division. So Jane eventually reached out to me, told me about the letter, and that there was going to be an add-on letter that survivors could sign. So one day when I was visiting my family in Florida, Jane emailed me the two letters so I could read them and give feedback, make sure I was comfortable signing it. As I read about the history of the SVD and just the documented systemic issues that have taken place in that department, it's been over a decade. The same sorts of complaints, the same problems, understaffing, undertrained detectives, Osgood's demands for more resources being ignored. It just unconscionable problems that had just not been addressed for over a decade. I was just beside myself with anger at how long this issue had been going on. I mean, you're talking about thousands of cases being affected.
And shit canned.
And shit canned, yes. I was so furious. And so when Jane asked me, would I speak with the Department of Justice investigators if they do want to talk to us, I'm like, yes, absolutely. In 2021, they interviewed me. I won't go into details about what we talked about because I want to keep that private, but they seemed to take it very seriously. They seemed to be taken aback by everything that I had to say. And they were going to talk to a whole bunch of other survivors about their experiences. Then things went pretty quiet. Jane would write to us and tell us that they seemed to be taking it seriously. It looked like we might get a real investigation, but she couldn't promise anything and we didn't know for sure. So everything just went quiet for a while. And then one day, it was in June 2022, I get a phone call from the New York Post. And it was a reporter that I had spoken to the year prior after I testified at a hearing. And I actually thought it was a butt dial because I thought, why would she be calling me? I don't have anything new to say. But I answered, and I thought it would be a 2-second phone call when she realized she called me by mistake. But she said, have you heard? And I said, about what? I was just working that day, so I didn't know what she was talking about. And she said, the DOJ just announced that they're opening a full investigation into the NYPD Special Victims Division. And I was calling to see if you had a comment. It's funny because I hadn't prepared for that moment at all. I didn't have a statement prepared, and I kind of mumbled something because I was so stunned. Shortly after I got off the phone with her, the New York Times called, and they also wanted a quote. At that point, I'd had a moment to collect myself, so that quote was a little better. And I finally looked down at my phone and I realized I had missed dozens of texts from people, other survivors, Jane, Osgood, everybody had been contacting me. And I just happened to not look at my phone because I was just working. It was kind of funny that that's how the news was broken to me. It was just a tremendous moment. It was justice that was a long time coming. It was a lot. And I went home to see my family in Florida, and it was right before the 4th of July. I remember going to the fireworks display and still in the heart of COVID. So it wasn't normally where it was taking place. Everybody was just kind of sitting on top of their cars and we were just watching the fireworks in the sky. But I just remember just being full of so much joy in that moment that we had managed to do that collectively by all telling our stories.
Yeah. Amazing. What I would like to address at this point is, how do you feel now, this day, as we're sitting here talking? What is the impact of that moment compared to how long it's taking, what the potential outcome of this is? How are you coping? How are you responding to all of this?
I'll be honest, when I saw that Trump got elected, my first thought was, oh no, there goes the investigation. Soon enough, the New York Times reached out for an interview about exactly that topic, as if my mind had been read. And I ended up giving an interview. And I was very careful with it because I don't want to get political. It's not about that. I'm not trying to criticize anybody. But the administration has made it very clear that they want to roll back investigations into police abuse. That's not a political statement. That's just what they have said. Actually, yeah, that's just fact. I was very afraid that they were going to shut this down. What I know is that it's still open for now, but all of these civil rights investigations are under review. And so we don't know yet what that's going to mean, if our investigation will be fine, and hopefully that's the case, or if it's going to be shut down. I will not react well if it gets shut down, but what I'm worried about is it's more about other survivors, because in some ways I did get justice for myself, but other survivors didn't. This is their only form of justice. If the Trump administration invalidates this investigation, stops it, blocks the consent decree, does any of that, it's just going to be devastating for a lot of people. And it's going to have a silencing effect on survivors in New York who might have been thinking about reporting. But then if they say, oh, well, this is how I'm going to be treated by law enforcement and nobody cares, they're not going to be held accountable, like, why should I bother? That's just really heartbreaking. It's definitely going to affect me if that's the outcome, but I'm just really worried about other survivors and how that's going to impact them. I have the privilege of being able to go to therapy and paying for therapy and taking care of myself, but not everybody does. Not everybody can afford these things. And I think it's just really going to impact a lot of people. And that would be really, really hard to see. It's a horrible message to be sending from the largest police force in the world. To know that the problems run so deep and have been going on for so long, and for even the investigation into what are clear and obvious failures, top to bottom, for the answer to be, well, let's just stop the investigation into all of that. I mean, wow, that's going to send a major chilling effect, I think, across the country. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that this investigation is allowed to continue, because I would be surprised if they didn't side with all the survivors, given the mountain of evidence from all of these cases that have been botched by law enforcement. I would be shocked if they didn't side with us. And I just hope that the investigation is allowed to continue so that you don't have that silencing effect. You have survivors who are validated. My goal is not to sit here and just complain about law enforcement. My goal is to see reforms happen. I don't want any of this to happen to other survivors. I want their cases to be properly investigated. I want there to be trauma-informed training. I want controlled calls to be rare and properly prepared for, instead of just, oh, let's do a controlled call, and if it's not successful, then the case is over. I don't want that to happen anymore. These are really basic things when you say them out loud. I'm hoping for reform and for things to change for the positive.
Leslie, this has been both extremely enlightening and very impactful and helpful, I think, for my listening audience from a victim survivor standpoint, but also hopefully extremely educational to those who listen that are involved in the criminal justice system. It's extremely brave of you to have been here with me and to share all of this. I would love to spend even more time with you talking about what those impacts have been on your life, both good and bad, and how you've managed to surge forward, pushing forward for the good of justice for victims and survivors. I often close out my episodes with the question of, what will you do now that we're done with this conversation? You take your headset off, you get away from the microphone, the recording's over, but all of these thoughts that you've been dealing with for 10 years are now fresh in your mind, as they are after every interview that you've been willing to conduct. Can you help my audience understand what you do to help take care of yourself, how you manage those implicit memories that come up as soon as we hang up. There's going to be implicit memories that surface for days, weeks, maybe even months after this interview is done.
Yeah.
What will you do to take care of yourself, and how will you handle all of this?
Well, I'll make a therapy appointment.
Good idea.
I really like spending time in nature. I like to go on very long walks and hikes with my dog. Even just spending time with my dog is always very grounding. He's a fluffy golden doodle who's very silly but very loyal. And it's nice to spend time with him and also with my family. I have a young son. So just spending time together and remembering that there's beauty in life. There's a lot of great things in my life to be thankful for. And even though I've gone through this horrific experience, there's still plenty of good to be grateful for. So I just try to cling to that. One other thing I should mention is that I also do some volunteering. I work with a nonprofit, Rise, and we work on passing legislation. And that also makes me feel really good to do something active that makes a difference, even if it's iterative and you only get one right passed into law. It's still something. It still, makes an impact. So I think that really matters. And I hope to be in a place eventually where I can spend even more time doing work that helps survivors, because it just makes me feel really good. And I really like making a difference.
You are. And I can tell you this episode is going to be a huge positive impact on many, many lives. I want you to know that you are appreciated and that I am full of gratitude for your participation here. I'm grateful for Rachel Izzo and her mentioning you and bringing you to my attention. And I'm appreciative of you being willing to take the time for this episode. It's amazing to me, and I appreciate you more than I can say.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having this platform, letting survivors come on and tell their stories, but also the experts that you have on as well. I mean, I've just learned so much from even the short amount of time I've been following the podcast. So I just want to say that back to you, that you are making a huge difference as well for the people who are listening. And it really matters. And I'll also say, as someone who has been deeply wronged by law enforcement, it's really important to have these collaborations between law enforcement and survivors. We should be talking to each other. We should be talking about ways to fix things and make it better for everybody. We really can't get very far if we're just talking to ourselves. So I really appreciate you having this platform and letting me come on to share my experience.
The pleasure's mine. And thanks for saying that, because as I've said before, those types of comments are fuel for me to keep doing what I'm doing. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll talk again.
I hope so.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Saying thank you to Leslie McFadden doesn't feel like it's enough. I wish there were words to express my sincere and heartfelt appreciation to Leslie for her willingness to be on this show. There's no doubt in my mind that Leslie's story and her admonition to law enforcement will have a deep and lasting positive impact on everyone who's had the opportunity to tune into both episodes. I am truly grateful to Leslie for sharing her story with us. My call to action this week is for you to share Leslie's episodes with everyone in your circle of influence. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, give the show a 5-star rating, and become a follower of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories on Instagram. All of this helps spread the message of bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another great way to do this is to start by believing. Whenever you hear a victim of rape or sexual assault tell their story, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to join us next week for another powerful episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.